Okay, good morning everybody. We are going to get started today. So delighted to see so many faces here for our first meetup for the Australasia Preserves Digital Preservation Community of Practice. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. So this event today was the brainchild of my colleague, Peter Niche. Peter, take your credit. So the idea was to use our existing Australasia Preserves community of practice to bring together people working in digitisation, to get together, share knowledge, share pain points, share practices, share workflows. So great to see so many familiar faces, and hello everybody online. Great to see you all as well. A little bit of housekeeping from me straight up. Note about our code of conduct, which we encourage everyone to be familiar with. There is a link to the code of conduct on the slides there. Australasia Preserves, it's a really diverse community from a really wide range of different backgrounds. So we really ask that everybody brings a spirit of respect and friendly inquiry to all of our events. So if anyone in the room today has any concerns, please feel free to come to me or one of my colleagues, Peter, or Jean up the back. Can you put your hand up for everyone, Jean? Thank you. And for anybody online, if there's any concerns during the day, you can use the chat box to contact any of us directly. So on that note, online people, the chat box is your space. So get in there, introduce yourselves, get a sense of who else is here today. We have some ideas for the discussion in the second part of today's event. We're going to trial a bit of online breakout rooms so that people participating online can contribute to the stuff that we're doing in the afternoon. So we're really excited about seeing how that goes. We are using collaborative notes today. This is a really great record we find months after the event. If as many people as possible from the community can jump in there, document your thoughts, document your notes in that document. It's really valuable, especially also for people following later, trying to catch up on what we discussed here today. Wi-Fi is on the whiteboard with username and password. Hopefully that's working for everybody. Anyone who's active on social media, please use the hashtag #OzPreserves. That's up the top there on the slides as well. Bathrooms for those in the room. Keep on going right down that corridor you came in, past the entrance to the Bellevue Library. You'll see some lifts ahead of you, veer left, and you'll see a corridor with all the bathrooms. Any other questions, feel free to contact us during the event. The agenda today, so we're going to have a range of talks from people. First up, we're going to start with some, we're calling it case studies and cautionary tales. And then we'll move on to a whole bunch of lightning talks about current practice and current workflows and a bit of the discussion about issues people are facing. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Jay Weatherburn, everybody. I work here at the University of Melbourne. I always forget to do that. Mental note to self. Silly. Okay, so after the lightning talks that we have, we'll have a break for morning tea. We have, it's actually our second birthday. It's the second birthday of our community of practice. And we have a cake because we always celebrate birthdays with cake. It's not here yet. It's going to make a special appearance right before morning tea. So sorry online people, no cake for you. But we'll share pictures. After morning tea, like I said, we're going to try a bit of discussion. For those in the room, we've got our tables set up really well. And for those online, we're going to try some breakout rooms. So hopefully lots of you can stick around for that. Okay, that's it. That's it for our housekeeping. Without further ado, I am going to launch into a big hello to William Kilbride and Sharon McMeekin from the Digital Preservation Coalition. William is stepping in very last minute for Paul, unfortunately, who can't be with us. So thank you, William, for doing that very last minute. We are so delighted to have you here. So William is the Executive Director of the Digital Preservation Coalition, and Sharon McMeekin is the Head of Workforce Development. These two love digital preservation so much, they are staying up at silly o'clock at night to be here live with us today. So please welcome William first up, and then he'll throw to Sharon.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. Thank you very much all for the warm welcome to join you. As You'll have spotted I'm not Paul Wheatley, so I'm going to do my best to impersonate Paul tonight, this morning, for you all. And really, I'll pass on very quickly then on to Sharon for some thoughts. Paul's shared his notes with me as well, though, and he promised he didn't intend to speak long. He promised to be brief, but he also promised to be direct in his words. Jay asked Paul to open with some words that were provocative to encourage discussion. So I'm going to apologise in advance and also distance myself from Paul's words, of course, because these are not my views, and you can follow up with Paul later. But anyway, Sharon and I, as Jay observes, have been working in digital preservation. Paul also. We've been working, I think, between us around 50 years in digital preservation, something in that nature. And we have had experience of all aspects of that, including picking up the pieces from badly planned digitisation projects. I'm going to reflect on that experience in a moment. There's a lot to talk about, which is why it's good, in fact, that the charge is for us to be brief. I'm going to open, though, with a thought of my own, which Paul didn't write down for me, but which is the one that I would always choose to start with when talking about digitisation. And I want audience participation in this, whether in the room or on the chat box, or just sitting at home on your own, or sitting in your office as appropriate. I would just like you to write down the phrase, digitisation is not digital preservation. Okay? So I want everyone in the room, I want you to say it out loud. I want to hear you. I can't hear you. You got to say it a bit louder. There's a long way away from Glasgow in Scotland, and you can put it in the chat box as well if you want. So that's a message, right? I know. That's a silly thing to say because you already know that, right? You know that is true. But I think we need to share our truths before we go further. And I think you have to get used to saying that out loud because I think other people won't understand that, and we may need to repeat that phrase often and over again so that they do understand it. Anyway, digitisation. Digitisation is that stunning and beautiful and engaging opportunity to do some really incredible work. It's a great thing. But much of it, I take the view, has happened without much of a thought of what will happen 6 months after the document has been removed from the scanner. And the experience we've had of working or delivering outsourced digitisation work, the experience we've had as funders of digitisation, working with the funders, advising people in digitisation and picking up the legacy of digitisation is really what I want to turn to. In the UK, there were huge amounts of money made available for digitisation in the late 1990s. It was fantastic. And since then, the heritage sector's been waiting for the next big cash drop to happen. And of course, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes. And too little has been done with that opportunity. Too little's been done with all the stuff we digitise then. And all too frequently, that's because not much can be done with all of that material. So, in what follows, names have been withheld. We will protect the innocent and the honest as well as the guilty. But in fact, I guess everyone's guilty. And the stuff I'm going to describe happens all too easily in any kind of institution. So I've got really 5 lessons to share with you. The first lesson is going to sound odd, but I'm going to suggest that for a lot of organisations, external funding for digitisation can be dangerous. Not that it's bad, but it can be dangerous. External funding is not for free, and it's not always obvious to the organisation that the digitisation effort will create a digital preservation derived demand. So the funding for digitisation doesn't come with no strings attached. Senior management may not understand this, and they will happily take on the funding without necessarily understanding the liabilities that arise as a result. Make no mistake, there is a sustainability overhead from digitisation funding. And of course, the more money that's available, the more likely that rules might get bent to obtain the money. Bespoke work is a special danger for digital preservation because it means potential workflows are not quite as you would expect them to be. And also, let's be honest, people that fund digitisation often don't understand digital preservation either, and they often don't fund it. And they certainly won't fund twice for the digitisation work that they've already paid for once. And of course, that's completely unfair. That's, however, the world I think that we too often find ourselves in. And I've got examples of those later if we can have time to discuss. The second lesson, actually stuff happens. Things go wrong. Software is a human project. It has bugs and mistakes. Networks go down. Storage fills up. People press the wrong button at the wrong time. And so in the context of a digitisation project, we have to expect those things to go wrong. We have to expect those errors to arise because that's how life is. Plan for it, however. Catch those mistakes. And that quality assurance role actually really, really matters. So does methodology and methodical working. So methodical working is going to be essential, which means thinking about workflows and process. The more effort goes into thinking about the process, the more likely the process is to succeed. Third observation is about the interface between the project and the institution. This is also incidentally why external funds seem to be dangerous. Let me give you an example. In one job, I got a massive telling off one morning when we failed to get the money that we had applied for from an external funder to do a big digitisation project. We got a massive telling off. In the afternoon of that very same day, I got hauled to a different level of management, the directorate, where we got an even bigger telling off for the grant that we did receive because we hadn't properly referenced the chief executive's approach to some particular issue. And it's that sort of institutional interface that seems to be a tripping hazard in digitisation. So how do projects get approved? Is there an approval process? Are we just chasing the money because we want the money? Or are we doing it for a strategic reasons? Are we presenting digitisation according to established guidelines? Or are we bending the rules in order that we can spend that extra money or cut corners so we can get more done? Who in the project, where is the legacy plan? Who's planning for sustainability? And embedded within that is a concern about digitisation guidelines. Where are the standards? Do we know the basic standards, the quality levels that we're content with, and the things we may need to do again? And of course, there's a counterpoint here. Firstly, what would happen for us to turn a project down? If there's an internal approvals process, have we ever turned down an opportunity for funding? Sometimes that might be wise. And another example I can think of, a massive digitisation project, which spent a huge amount of money, but was probably 2 years too soon because the technology moved on and they're left with what looks now like a kind of slightly ancient technology, when in fact it could have been really great had they simply waited. Also, approvals process implies to some extent an audit process. So are we actually properly going around and doing the quality assurance? Do we know the checksums are there? Have we someone actually created and checked the checksums for each copy activity and so forth? Number 4, outsourcing. Okay, outsourcing's not free. So there are responsibilities, right? And we've talked a little bit about responsibilities being important in terms of the management structure, but outsourcing requires a handling of those responsibilities in a different way. You can't completely outsource responsibility for work, even if you're getting a third-party digitisation vendor in. And there are very good third-party digitisation vendors. You can't turn your nose up at that. The trick is to find the good supplier with a thorough trial and validation of the results of each potential supplier before you sign the contract. You can apply automated profile checking of the files, the metadata, the structure, and there are lots of tools that will help you do that. However, the relationship with the supplier remains critical. I once worked with a big digitization project in a tiny organization. And we had an outsourced partner who was going to do the digital preservation repository partner at the end. They were going to do the looking after the stuff for us. And it all looked great in terms of planning until the repository partner went bust. They went bust in the middle of the project. And what looked like a great plan, suddenly not such a clever plan. So let's move on. Fifth lesson, the project is dead. Long live the project. So design the project with an exit strategy or a legacy plan, particularly if the hosting of the content is going to be involved. So where am I going with that? An all singing, all dancing, fancy website which provides exceptional access is a wonderful thing, but it also has a finite life. So the interface to the data is going to live less, will be have a shorter life cycle than the data itself. So we need to plan to remove it from that interface and for it to be accessible. Digitisation funders are concerned often with access, and that means they drive us towards a fancy, unique, clever, innovative website, especially because that seems good sometimes to be engaging with the latest crowdsourcing technology or the latest whatever it might be technology, and that can be a risk. There's a huge array of digitised content at a file level. And so actually having it available at a file level is fine for the purposes of preservation, even if the delivery mechanism is redesigned on an ongoing basis. So I've rambled on a little bit. There are 5 lessons here. External funding can be dangerous. You should expect stuff to happen and go wrong. A critical moment in the project is the interface between the project and the institution. Outsourcing creates particular sets of responsibilities to be understood, and plan for the project to survive beyond the life cycle of the project development work. And finally, to end where I began, to share our truth once more, the digitisation and digital preservation are different things. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Sharon, who's going to take us through a few examples that she's been working on or has historically worked on.
Well done, William. You had 7 minutes and you only talked for 12. Anyway, following on from William, I'm going to pick up a few of those themes through 3 case studies that I've drawn from my time as an archivist in the cultural heritage sector in Scotland. So I think this is where we're coming to the case studies and perhaps more likely the cautionary tales. Less fun is that I'm going to anonymise these, so you won't know who I'm actually talking about, which always makes gossip a little bit less fun. But hopefully some real world examples of things that William's just talked about. So the first example is a huge digitisation project from an academic library where they'd got a big chunk of that kind of late 90s, early 2000s funding for digital preservation that William talked about that came through a source called the Heritage Lottery Fund. They had this amazing collection of early 20th century photography that really kind of documented the breadth of local culture in the area they were based in. They decided for digitisation that they were going to go out to a third-party provider. But the big flaw they had there was they didn't really think about their own internal workflow of what to do when they actually got the digitised images back from the company who was doing it for them. All they really thought about was actually getting all of this stuff digitised. They didn't think about workflows for transferring the digitised images from the media that they were being delivered in. They didn't think about metadata production. They didn't think about how they would actually provide access to them. And when they actually set about actually thinking about how they would do that, they realised that they had a massive problem. And what they saw originally as being, I think, about a 6-month project ended up lasting for something closer to 3 years in terms of the time it took them to process and make available what they could of those images. Because one of the big problems that they had was the material had been delivered from the digitisation company on CDs. And early, kind of in the first year of the project, in terms of kind of metadata creation and processing, they were running at a rate of about 25% of the CDs being corrupted. And that was only increasing over time. So I don't know what it was like by the end of it, but I can imagine there was significant data losses. The second case study today is touching on things that William said there about kind of websites. So in this case, it was a large kind of e-learning resource which offered paid subscriptions to kind of community groups and kind of educational groups around Scotland to access digitized images and information about them. They harvested some things from existing digitisation projects, but also sponsored digitisation themselves. And I got to know them when they were kind of consumed into an organisation that I was already working on. And they had one of those overly complicated bespoke websites that William talked about, where they'd gone out again to a third party to ask them to build the website. And all the access they really had was kind of through web forms and support from the web hosting company. When I asked them, where do you keep the copies of your data? The answer was on the website. So it turned out they actually had no direct access to the digital files on a server or any kind of storage facility that we were go for digital preservation, nor direct access to the metadata held about it either, other than through this web form. And when we started to push on that a little bit further, they said, oh, we do have a copy of them though, but it turned out they had it on literally thousands of CDs held in 35 filing cabinets in a storage room. So that actually thinking about the amount of effort that we would revolved getting those back off the CDs, let alone whether those CDs would be accessible in the first place, is kind of mind-boggling. So it's a real kind of wake-up call to them that perhaps the way that they were approaching sustainability for the resources might not be the best in the long term. They also did suffer a little bit from what William said about being quite early to the game, and perhaps the resources that they were creating weren't quite as good as they could have been. A kind of tail on the other side of that will be the third case study that I'll talk about briefly. And it was digitisation done at an organisation where all of the work was done by professional photographers. So people who had real kind of skills in photography. And this created some of the most beautiful digitised images I've ever seen. They were working with kind of drawings and plans that were just, they're gorgeous objects in themselves, and they rendered them fantastically digitally. But they were also not interested in hearing about how to actually create an efficient digitisation workflow, so that the way they went about it was really kind of labour intensive and created absolutely massive files for us to be storing in the long term. So they were also, because of their kind of artistic temperament, as shall we say, very keen to make sure that every image looked its best, and would always spend time fixing the image, as they would put it, using Photoshop. So this then has kind of really big impacts going forward as to a kind of resource drain on storage of the digital objects. When you've got things coming out that are like several gigabytes, which at that point was really, really huge for a single image, and you're looking to perhaps maintain multiple copies of those, it becomes quickly unrealistic, particularly for a cultural heritage body which doesn't have all of the money in the world. It also brings up real questions about the authenticity of these as copies of the digital objects that they were meant to represent, given the amount of kind of Photoshop manipulation that sometimes were going into that. So you need to really be thinking about digitisation processes and how much kind of human interaction you're having that might be changing the object itself. So those are three of the cautionary tales from the career of Sharon McMeekin. So I think now we're ready to hand over for a few minutes for questions. I think we maybe have got 2 minutes left.
Nice one, Sharon. Thank you very much. So yeah, we have literally 5 minutes or just under for questions. If anyone wants to jump in, take advantage of these guys. Make them work. It's late at night. Let's see how they perform. Anyone want to jump in, or anybody online as well? I'll have a look and see if there's questions in here. Tonight I'm joined by William Kilbride and Sharon McMeekin. Welcome both.
Hi there.
Hi, Jay.
So we are following up a few questions that we had from our Australasia Preserves digitisation meetup. We've got some questions to go through. Here's the first one. A question for Sharon from Samaya. If you were one of those organisations now with a decade or two of legacy digitised content, what would your strategy be to get it managed and preserved?
Luckily, image content's relatively stable over time. So at this point, I'd be looking to get in place some simple bitstream preservation actions. So we're looking at making sure the content is on a secure piece of storage with multiple copies in place. We'd be looking at doing some at least minimal metadata generation using a characterization tool, and also getting in place regular integrity checks to make sure that this material is staying the same over time. And there's plenty of free tools out there available to help you do kind of both characterization and integrity checking. And if you want to know more about this, I'll also do a trailer. We're currently working on an online learning course for the UK National Archives on bitstream preservation, which will be freely available in the coming months. So keep an eye out for that. I'll pass over to William now in case he has anything else to add.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have much to add, only to underline and to kind of reiterate what Sharon has said. Maybe what I could add, though, is a project which Samaya will know a lot about. Actually, a few years ago, Samaya and colleagues did a bit of a study of images held at the Bodleian Library. And what was amazing to me was just the sheer numbers, and I won't have the numbers to hand, but it was certainly in the hundreds of millions of digitized items in the collection. And the point of that is, there's a lot of big numbers, which means that even if they suffered only a tiny proportion, maybe 1% or 0.1% of data loss, that's still a large number, because if you're talking in the millions, you're talking about having actually a material impact on data loss. So all the things that Sharon's saying are vital and true, and even more true, of course, the larger the collection will be. And if it's a decade or more ago, quite possible that the collection's been added to and added to and added to. So the time for action is now. Don't leave it too long.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting case study you bring up, William. And at the risk of giving Samaya more work, I'm sure if people have questions about that, they can get in touch through the forum.
I recall there's actually a really good blog around the issues by Edith Halverson, with whom Samaya worked, and which was about assessing, and we're just looking and measuring the size of the collection, and it would be certainly worth a look.
Great. All right, so question 2, we'll move along. This is a question for William, also from Samaya. Yeah. Do you have documented examples or resources of the costs, effort involved in preparing and preserving digitized content measured against the amount of funding cost of digitization?
Yeah, I don't have those figures to hand, and that's because digitization can be a dramatically different activity depending on the type of institution. So I'll give you the example of a big digitization project I was involved in. So you may know I worked in museums before I came into the DPC. The museum I worked in had a very, very substantial collection of tapestries. Now, digitization, just the photography of those, was a massive undertaking because of the equipment that was required in order to effectively hang the tapestries, in order that they could be properly lit and properly photographed. And any one photograph would cost 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks work simply to get one good image. That's different from large scale book digitization, for example, where you can, with the right equipment, set up a scanning service very quickly and kind of rattle your way through books at a fairly standard rate. So it's very difficult to put a cost on digitization, and equally it can be hard to put costs on digital preservation. But here's a rule of thumb. Okay, I can give you a rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb comes from a chap called Barend Mons, who is a senior officer at the European Union, involved in a great deal of the European Union research work. And his estimate is that the cost of preservation should be costed into projects at around 5% of the project costs. So if you have a digitisation project of, I don't know, $100, you need to set aside $5 for digital preservation. Obviously that scales up also, but I would guess that that is a good rule of thumb. Let me attack that from the other direction though, and Samaya is also asking us around what are the costs of recovery, and the costs of recovery are very substantial. Some colleagues of mine at Glasgow University, actually in the late 90s, some time ago now, Anne Gow and Seamus Ross did a study on the economics of what they called digital archaeology, which is the cost of recovery from obsolete or degraded devices. Now, there's some myths here. Actually, almost all material could be recovered. The real issue is whether or not we can afford to recover it. And the very clear evidence is that by and large, digital archaeology is a unique, a niche subject, which is going to cost an awful lot of money. And so can we really afford that? Well, I'd rather have the managed costs estimated at 5% than an unmanaged cost, which we simply can't anticipate early on. So that's my kind of instinctive responses. Sharon, you might have more up-to-date information. I realise I'm reaching back into the late 90s for my case study there. There's probably more recent stuff that you're familiar with, though, perhaps, Sharon.
No. I think that when we were preparing for actually joining this event, I had a look around to see if you could find any of those kind of costings or any reports on people who have had to retrieve material that had been lost. And to be honest, there wasn't really much information out there. So if anybody does have experience of that, I think the community really needs some case studies and would love to hear more.
Yeah. This is one of those areas where the kind of the fail club model is actually very important, isn't it? Where we're able to share the mistakes that we've made, because there's very few places where you're able to share those in a professional context. There's very little drivers for that. So it's a call out for that as well, isn't it, Sharon?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, great tips and great call out, you two. I think we will move along. Another question for Sharon. This one's from Kyla. Regarding the third case study, if you can recall, I am put in mind of the recent alteration of the IWD photograph by the National Archives in the USA and your comments about authenticity. Should we be building this into our digital preservation ethics or making interventions, workflows visible?
Yeah, I definitely think if you want to be able to prove authenticity, you should be building it into both of those things. It should be within your kind of ethical statement about how you're approaching digital preservation. And also, at the very least, you should be documenting internally what you've done to any terms of interventions in relation to digital photographs. And potentially, if they are substantial, you should be releasing that information out to your users as well. If there is any kind of real content change. I think ultimately, I would say that the smaller amount of intervention possible, the better. But yeah, if there is anything there, it should be well documented and kind of clear to anybody who's accessing those photos.
William, anything to add on the back of that?
Well, again, I think Sharon's on the money, as usual here. Maybe to observe perhaps that almost all digital preservation is some action of packing and unpacking, of copying and changing and replicating. And so almost every digital preservation workflow involves some threat to authenticity. And therefore, every digital preservation workflow has to embed some sort of authenticity planning. But that's really just to emphasize again what Sharon's already said.
Yep, indeed. Thank you both. And finally, to wrap up, question for either, which I take to mean both, from Barbara. Great case studies of disasters. Is there any emerging costings from remediation of dodgy projects? Good fodder for getting management to understand that bad projects can be worse than no projects, etc.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could refer just briefly to sort of previous answers, so the question of addressing the digital archaeology one, I think is still true, and applies here. So there's a cost, okay, and we can, in different circumstances, identify what those costs would be. But I think if we purely, and that can be enough. That can be enough in terms of management taking it seriously. But the cost is also reputation. The cost is also opportunity. The cost is also in terms of skills and the things that you might choose to do, you know. So a little very current example for us in Scotland is that there is a very important historical document in the history of Scotland called the Declaration of Arbroath. It's by coincidence the 700th anniversary, so 1320 it was written. Susan Corrigal, who is one of our board members, she's actually in charge of presenting that on the 700th anniversary, and she uses the phrase of stealing from the future. So the document is very fragile and can only be exposed to light for a few hours in a year, you know. So there's something in that, you know. If we can't continually be redigitizing, we're borrowing from the future, as it were. So there are all sorts of other costs over and above the financial cost, I think, is the point I'm trying to make there. We can't constantly be redigitizing materials if we have to. That was a bit of a ramble though, Sharon. Do you want to come in there? Anything to add?
Yeah, I think, again, going back to one of the previous answers, on investigation, there doesn't seem to be a lot of information out there about actual costs, like hard figures. But I think I would agree with William that for a lot of organisations, particularly in the public sector and cultural heritage, you can't underestimate the reputational risk as well. And I think that's why risk is a word that we use a lot in relation to digital preservation and to these types of projects, that you should be taking a robust approach to risk management. And going hand in hand with that, as William said, thinking about the opportunities that can be generated from it. And sometimes being able to couch the kind of issues that you're having in kind of risk management talk can be as effective as using kind of hard figures in persuading kind of senior management, because while they might not understand the kind of projects that we're doing in digital preservation, they will likely understand risk management.
Absolutely. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight on Digital Preservation Television. I say tonight, but for you guys, it's early morning. Thank you so much for joining me.
There's blue sky up there.
Wow, beautiful. Well, thank you, Sharon. Much appreciated, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye all.